They cut off my head in front of 10,000 people. Every single one of them cheered. I remember thinking, so that is what 10,000 people sound like. I remember the sound more than the blade. The roar built low and slow. Then it exploded across the Capitol Square like something that had been held underwater too long. My name was Kale. In Orenville, that name used to mean something real. Youngest general in 300 years of recorded military history. The man who held the Northern Pass for 11 days. For 100 soldiers against an army 12 times that size. People wrote songs about it. I never liked the songs. The man the king personally decorated with a golden sword at the victory ceremony. I still remember the weight of that medal. Cold and heavy against my chest. The king's hands were shaking when he penned it. I thought it was emotion. I was young and proud and completely wrong. It was not emotion. It was guilt. 6 months after that ceremony, I was on a wooden platform in chains. The royal herald read the charges: treason, conspiracy with Eastern warlords, selling military positions for gold. I did not do any of it. Not one word of those charges was true. But the evidence was flawless. Letters with my seal. Witnesses who swore under sacred oath. Coins buried under my floorboards. Someone had spent years building this trap. Someone who knew exactly how I thought and where I kept things. Someone who understood precisely what people would believe about me. I worked it out while standing on that platform. 10,000 people screaming. I was running the logic the same way I ran every battlefield problem. The timing. The specific charges. The one person who could have spoken for me and chose silence instead. 7 years of friendship. And he chose silence. David, my closest friend. 7 years fighting beside each other. I had saved his life twice with my own body. First advisor to the crown prince. The man who gained everything from my removal. I found him in the crowd. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not guilt, not satisfaction. Cold relief. Like a man who has finished something heavy and set it down at last. I almost laughed. Standing in chains about to die, and I almost laughed. Then the blade came down. Then everything was dark. Then I woke up face down in the mud with rain on my neck. Something warm and wet was pressed against my ear. I opened my eyes slowly and looked around at a world I did not recognize. A goat was examining my face. Serious expression. The look of an animal that has found something suspicious and has not yet decided what to do about it. I pushed myself up. My arms were wrong. Too thin. Too short. I looked at my hands. Small fingers. The hands of a child, not of a soldier who spent 7 years at war. I found a puddle. Looked at my own reflection. A boy. Maybe 14 or 15. Thin face. Dull eyes. Patchy hair going in several directions at once. Like it had given up on having a plan. There was a scar on his left cheek and another on his chin. Old and healed badly. The kind you get from falls, not from fights. From a life where nobody taught you to protect yourself. I learned his name over the following days. My name now Wei. Just Wei. No family name. In the village of Dunmao at the base of the Greywood Mountains, in a kingdom called Sorath. I also learned quickly that Wei had a reputation in Dunmao. The strange one. The slow one. The boy who laughed at wrong moments and stared too long and said things that made people uncomfortable. The village idiot. That was what they called him. Behind his back and sometimes right to his face. That was what they called me now. I filed that information and said nothing for a week. I spent the first week sorting through Wei's memories like going through a box of broken things. His parents were dead. No family at all. He lived alone at the edge of the village. The building he called home barely qualified as one. The roof leaked into places. A crack in the east wall was wide enough to put your whole hand through. He owned 3 bowls and 1 pot and a sleeping mat. Under that mat, he kept a small carved wooden horse. I found it on my second day. Held it for a long time. The carving was careful, patient. Someone had loved this boy and made him something to prove it. The third day, older boys came to the door. Not to visit. The tallest one was named Broth. Maybe 17, thick-necked and completely certain of himself. The kind of boy who has never been seriously challenged by anything. He told me to come outside and do something funny for them. I looked at him, not the way Wei used to look at people directly. The way I used to look at soldiers under my command when something needed to be understood immediately. Broth went quiet. His friends went quiet. I said, "Get out." The voice of a man who has given the order before and waited to see what happened next. He left. They all left. One of them looked back while walking and stepped straight into the door frame, watching me instead of where he was going. I did not find that funny. Well, a small part of me found it slightly funny. I am not entirely made of stone, and never claimed to be. After they left, I sat on the sleeping mat and thought for a long time. I was dead. My real body finished. David was somewhere warm and comfortable right now, being thanked by the right people. I could accept this new life. Start small. Stay quiet. Forget everything that had been done to me. I held that option in my mind for approximately 10 minutes. Then I put it down and left it there permanently. I picked up the wooden horse, looked at it, put it back under the mat. I was not going to forget. The question was not whether to act. The question was how and when. I had a mind. To lifetimes of memories now loaded into the same body. Wei's quiet, careful knowledge of this valley and these mountains and these people. And mine. 7 years of military command. Supply lines and troop movements and the way decisions made in palaces become bodies on the ground. The real way power moves through a kingdom. Not through ceremonies. Through hunger and fear and the small loyalties of men who want things and are afraid of losing them. On my 5th day, I found something that changed every calculation I had made so far. I was moving the old chest. My hand slipped on a nail, and I cut my palm on the edge. A thin cut, maybe 2 inches. I held my hand up, watched the blood, then I watched it stop. Not slowly, immediately. The cut closed on its own in 30 seconds. Clean skin where there had been a wound. I stared at my palm for a long moment. Then I tested it again deliberately. Because if you want to understand something, you test it properly, and you test it more than once. The result was identical. This body healed at a rate that was not natural. Not even close to natural. I filed it carefully and began testing everything else methodically. The same way I had always assessed new resources on a campaign. But before the physical tests, there was something else I needed to understand first. The world itself. What it was. What rules it ran on. Wei's memories gave me the broad strokes. Sorth was a kingdom of maybe 4 million people. Rural, agricultural, mountain bordered. The capital was a city called Verith. 3 days walk north through the high pass, which was the only way through from this valley. The king was a man named Aldrich III. Wei's memories of him were distant and impersonal. The way common people hold images of rulers they will never see. A face on coins. A name read aloud at tax time. Aldrich had a son, a crown prince named Kalen. 17 years old, apparently talented with a sword and considered promising by the people around him. Entirely unprepared for the weight of what he would inherit. Wei had heard this from travelers. He had stored it the same way he stored everything. Without purpose? I found it and gave it purpose. I found it and gave it purpose. A teenage crown prince with talent and no wisdom as a lever. I filed that and moved on. The kingdom was not at war. Not actively. But the eastern border had been unstable for several years and nobody had managed to stabilize it. Raids from the hill clans. Disputes over mountain territories. The kind of slow grinding friction that empires always manage badly and that eventually becomes something with a proper name and a body count. The army was small and under-equipped by the standards of what I had commanded. But small armies in difficult terrain fight differently from large ones on open ground. I knew both kinds of fighting and both kinds of army. I stored what Wei's memories gave me and began filling the gaps methodically and without rushing. There was magic in this world. That was perhaps the biggest adjustment I had to make. Not the flashy, dramatic kind, not subtle. A healer in the next village who could close wounds with her hands. A trader who passed through once a season with goods always in perfect condition regardless of weather. The sharp-eyed boy I had noticed in Dunmao, who sometimes seemed to know things before they happened. Small things, but consistently. Wei had not understood any of this as unusual. He had grown up with it the way you grow up with weather. Noticing it, but not examining it. I examined it. If there was magic in this world and if Wei's strange body was connected to it, then what I was working with was not just inherited physical capability. It might be something with a name and a tradition around it. Something that could be developed, taught, eventually used in very specific and deliberate ways. I needed more information before I could know what questions to ask. But I held the hypothesis and kept adding to it. The wooden horse, the family and the hypothesis with powerful enemies, the body that healed itself. These 3 things wanted to be connected. I intended to find out how. The second thing I noticed about Dunmao after pulse skimming was the information flow. Who knew what? Who told whom? How news moved through the village and where it came from before it arrived. Every village has someone who knows everything before anyone else does. In Dunmao, that person was the woman who ran the grain store. Her name was Mari. She was 40-something, sharp-eyed, The kind of memory that held prices from 3 years ago and names of travelers who passed through exactly once and were never seen again. She was also the one who spoke to Wei most loudly and slowly, over-enunciating every word the way you do with someone you have already decided cannot follow normal conversation. That habit told me how she processed information. She sorted people by first impression and did not revise easily. That was both a weakness and a thing I could use. I was going to have to revise her impression of me. That would take time and a very specific kind of patience that most people do not actually possess. Not the patience of waiting for something to happen. The patience of letting someone reach a conclusion on their own. Conclusions that arrive on their own always hold better than ones you push people toward. I started going to her store every few days. Not to buy much, just to be present in a different way than Wei had been present. Not staring, not saying odd things. Just quiet, just there. Gradually becoming a different shape in her memory than the shape she had filed me under. On my third visit, she forgot to over-enunciate and did not notice. On my fifth, she stopped raising her voice entirely, also without noticing. On my seventh, she mentioned something about the harvest without explaining what a harvest was. Small progress. But progress was progress, and I was not in a hurry. The mountain itself was the other thing I needed to understand. Not just the valley floor. The mountain above it, the high passes. The direction Wei had been brought down from. The direction where the family with powerful enemies had apparently lived and died. I started climbing in the early mornings. Not going far, not yet. Staying on the lower slopes. Learning how the paths branched and what the ground felt like at different altitudes. Learning where the snow line sat at this time of year. Where it would sit into months when the season turned. You plan for the mountain you will be climbing, not the one you are on now. On my 7th morning climb, I found something. A marker. A flat stone set upright in the ground in a way that was not natural. Someone had placed it deliberately. It was at an intersection of paths on the lower slope, in exactly the spot where someone who knew what to look for would find it. Someone who did not know would walk past it every day and see nothing. Carved into the stone, very small and very precise, was a symbol I did not recognize. Two interlocked circles with a line through both. Simple and deliberate. The kind of mark that means something very specific to the right person and nothing at all to everyone else. I stood at that marker for a long time. Then I covered it back with moss the way it had been and walked back down to the village and thought about it all day. Someone had been to this spot. Someone who left marks for people who would know to look. Maybe recently. Maybe years ago. I could not tell from the moss, which had grown back the way moss does that slowly, without keeping records of when it started. But the mark was there and carefully made. By someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Who expected someone specific to come this way and find it eventually. I filed the marker in my memory carefully, next to everything else I was collecting. Everything in order. Everything assigned its correct place and weight. I had spent years learning to be patient about the things I did not yet understand. This world was going to require all of that patience, and then considerably more. I walked the valley before dawn every morning, hard and uphill and sustained. The pace that wins a grown man within an hour. 2 hours the first morning, and I felt absolutely nothing. No tiredness at all. I found a fallen log near the north edge of the valley and tested my strength over 3 days. The numbers were consistently wrong in the upward direction. Wrong in the way that means something very specific. A boy Wei's size and age, under most of his life, should not have moved what I moved. But I moved it, every single time, without effort. Then the fall. I was climbing the western face. I misjudged a grip and dropped 15 feet onto hard ground. The kind of fall that breaks wrists and cracks ribs. I landed, took inventory, and stood up. My left wrist had been at an angle wrists do not bend. I watched it straighten on its own over 2 minutes. Bone setting itself. Swelling appearing and then disappearing. I flexed the wrist, fully functional. Whatever Wei had been, he was not what anyone in this village believed. They had spent years treating him as their least impressive member. The whole time this body had been sitting quietly with capabilities that my best soldiers would have respected. Nobody asked, nobody tested, nobody thought to, nobody had known. Wei himself had not known. He had been told he was nothing his entire life and believed it completely. He had never once pushed against that story to find out whether it was actually true. That was both genuinely sad and immediately useful to me. Bodies like this come from bloodlines, from something inherited. Wei had never been trained or cultivated, which meant the ability was in his blood. Which meant someone in his family was something remarkable, which brought me back to the wooden horse under the mat. The patient careful cuts, the love in the craft. Wei's parents, dead when he was young. Nobody in Dunmao seemed to know much about them. The village elder was named Torv. old enough that he seemed to remember things from before anyone else's memory began. I went to him in the second week and asked directly about Wei's origins. He went quiet in a specific way. The boy came from the mountains, he said finally. Further up in the passes, a traveler brought him down and left him. The man never came back. He never left a name. I asked if there was anything else. Torv looked at his hands for a long moment. There was a story, he said slowly. A family in the high passes. They had made enemies of powerful people. The kind of enemies who do not forgive. The kind who do not stop until the matter is closed permanently. He stopped there and did not continue. I waited. He had said enough. A family in the high passes with powerful enemies. A child left in a village and never claimed. A body that healed itself and refused to tire and was stronger than any reasonable explanation could account for. Wei had not been abandoned because he was worthless. He had been hidden because he was dangerous to someone specific, placed in a village to look like nothing while being something else entirely. A nobody with a strong body survives. A hidden heir with the right bloodline and to lifetimes of knowledge is something else entirely. No one knew what I actually was. The people who put me in the ground could never have prepared for what that meant. I did not know yet exactly which one I was, but finding out had just moved to the top of everything else. Above even moving north, above even Davin. Dunmao had 300 people, 1 rodent and out. 1 well, 1 elder. A lord named Sethwick who came down 4 times a year to collect taxes. His steward Paul did the real work of the estate. Paul had been skimming for years, carefully, a little at a time, over a long time. The kind of theft invisible unless you know exactly which numbers to check and what they should say versus what they do say. 7 years managing army supply lines teaches you that. Every way money can disappear without leaving an obvious mark. I had seen all of them. I filed Paul's theft and waited for the correct moment to use it. The 3 people in Dunmao worth knowing were not the loud ones. They never are. Old Pen sat outside the elder's house each morning, watching the road like he was waiting for something long overdue. Young Essa carried water from the well alone each evening. She hummed quietly to herself, unbothered by solitude in a way that only comes from long practice. And a boy of 11 or 12, always slightly apart from the other children, watching instead of joining. Sharp eyes that miss nothing. In every group, in every situation, the people paying attention while everyone else performs are the ones worth knowing. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I began spending time near each of them. Not intrusively, consistently present, letting them decide when to notice me. On the 40th day I made my first move, deliberately small. I brought Torv specific numbers and dates. Grain weights that did not match the official records. Pole's theft laid out clearly enough to act on. Torv studied the numbers for a long time without speaking. He turned the page over. He turned it back. How do you know this? He said finally. We noticed things. I told him. He just never told anyone. That was not entirely false. Wei had observed everything. He just never used any of it. What do you want to do with this? Torv asked. Nothing yet, I said. I want you to know it exists, so that when I need something from you, you remember that I gave you something first. Not a threat. A statement of how real exchange works between people who respect each other. Torv had been an elder for 30 years. He understood immediately. He nodded once. That was all that was needed. I walked home in the cold late afternoon with the mountains pressing close on both sides. I thought about Davin in his warm room, the king who looked me in the eye on that platform and did not look away, the crown prince at my trial, 17 years old, his face still becoming whatever it would be. He had wept, real tears, which meant he had not known the threat against him was invented. A person who had been used, not one who had acted. That distinction was worth keeping in mind. I reached the door of the structure that was my home, still leaking, still cracked, 3 bowls, 1 pot, a sleeping mat. I stood in the doorway and looked out at the valley going dark in the evening, the mountains on both sides pressing close, cold settling into the narrow spaces between the mountains, the kind that settles in high places early and stays late. I knew this cold. 7 years in the northern pass had put it into me permanently. Cold is never just a condition. It is a variable that changes everything around it if you ignore it. I went inside and picked up a wooden horse from under the mat, sat in the last light from the crack in the east wall and turned it slowly in my hands. The mane was done in tiny parallel cuts that caught light differently at each angle. Patient work, someone who cared about the result. The eyes were as circles with a smaller circle inside each one. That gave the horse a look of attention, like it was watching something only it could see. Someone made this for a child they were leaving behind, a child they could not protect. They needed to leave something that would last and say what words could not. I made this carefully. That means I saw you clearly. That means you were worth seeing and worth the time it took to make something true. I put the horse back under the mat carefully. Everything in order. Everything in time. The village idiot had never been what anyone thought. The village idiot was done being a punchline. And the people who put me in the ground had no idea what was already moving in their direction. Drop a comment below. Who do you think David is more afraid of right now? The king he serves, or the boy he thought was dead? The marker on the mountain stayed in my head for 3 days. 2 interlocked circles with a line through both. Simple and deliberate and clearly meant for someone specific. I did not go back to it immediately. That was the first instinct and the wrong one. If someone had left the mark expecting someone to find it, then they might also check whether it had been found. Returning too quickly would tell them something. Returning after a normal interval told them nothing. I waited 8 days. Then I went back. The moss had not been disturbed. The stone was exactly as I had left it, but there was something new carved into the base of the stone, very small, below the original mark. A single horizontal line with a short vertical mark through its right end. Simple. But it had not been there before. Someone had added it after my visit. Someone had been here after me. Someone who had seen that the marker was recently uncovered and had added to it. The new mark looked like a direction indicator .east, or a distance marker, 1 unit of something. I stood at that stone for a long time and felt, for the first time since waking up in the mud, something that was not calculation, something closer to anticipation. Someone knew I was here, or knew someone was here, or had been checking this marker regularly for years and finally found evidence that someone had looked at it. Any of those 3 possibilities was interesting. None of them was bad. I covered the stone again and walked back down. I did not tell Torv. I did not tell anyone. Some information you keep entirely to yourself until you understand it completely. This was the kind of information. The days in Dunmao had developed a rhythm by now. Dawn climbs on the mountain. Morning in the village. Afternoons were for observation and for the small steady work of changing how people saw me. It was working. Slowly and without drama, which is the only way real change actually works. No single moment, just accumulation. In the way that real change always works, which is not dramatically, but in small consistent increments that add up over time without anyone being able to point to a single moment when things shifted. Broff and his friends no longer came to my door. They passed it sometimes and glanced over, but kept walking. That was fine. I was not interested in their approval. I was interested in their absence. Marit at the grain store had started acknowledging me with a nod when I came in. Small thing, but a nod means you have registered as a person rather than a piece of furniture. That was progress I could build on. Small foundation. But foundations are what you start with and everything else comes after. Old Pan had spoken to me once. Nothing significant. He had asked if the rain earlier in the week had gotten into my roof again. I said yes. He nodded as if this confirmed something he already believed. That was the whole conversation. But it was a conversation which was more than Wei had ever managed to have with him. Something had shifted. The sharp-eyed boy I had noticed was named Cobb. I had learned that from overhearing other children. Cobb almost never spoke. He watched. He had been watching me specifically for about 2 weeks now, with a focused attention of someone trying to work out a problem. I let him watch. You do not rush this kind of thing. You let it develop at the pace it wants to develop at and you stay available. The thing I had not yet figured out was Essa. She was the most interesting one of the 3 and also the most careful. She had not acknowledged me at all, not with a nod or a glance. When I was near the well in the evening, she continued her routine without acknowledgement, as if I did not exist, as if I had never existed. That level of precision takes practice. But she had changed her humming. That was the thing I noticed on the 4th day of observing her. She had changed the song. The previous song had been something simple and repetitive, a work rhythm. The new song was more complicated. It had variations. It circled back on itself in ways that did not happen in simple work music. I did not know if that was meaningful. I noted it anyway. Everything goes in the file until you understand it. On the 45th day, Torf came to my door in the early morning for the first time. He stood in the doorway and looked at me with his working expression. He looked at me for a moment with the expression I had started thinking of as his working face. The one he used when he was about to say something he had spent time considering. "There is a man coming today," he said. "He collects debts for Lord Sethwick. Not Paul. A different man. He comes twice a year, and he is not pleasant." I waited. Last time he came, Torf said, he took old Heron's second cow. Heron couldn't pay the full amount. The man took the cow and broke Heron's wrist when he objected. Sethwick did nothing about it. I understood what Torv was telling me. He was not asking me to do anything. He was informing me of a situation. He was also, in the careful way of a man who has been an elder for 30 years, giving me information I could choose to act on. I thanked him. He nodded once and left without adding anything. Torv was a man who understood that some exchanges were complete in very few words. The debt collector arrived at midday. His name was apparently Gren. Wei's memories held no image of him, but the village's reaction to his arrival was informative. People moved inside. Doors closed. The well area, which was always occupied at midday, emptied out in under 5 minutes. Doors closed across the village like someone was pulling them shut one by one. Gren was a large man, not tall but broad, with the build of someone who had spent years using physical presence as a professional tool. He had 2 men with him, both younger, both carrying clubs. He went to 3 houses before he came to mine. I watched from the doorway. At each house the same pattern played out. He named an amount. The family produced whatever they could. If it was not enough, his men took something. Nobody argued. Nobody could afford to. When he reached my door, I was already outside. He looked at me for a moment, then at the building, then back at me. His expression said that he had come to collect from a boy living in a ruin, and this was not going to be complicated. Wei, he said, you owe 3 months. Wei doesn't have anything worth taking. I said, you'd be better off moving on. He studied me. Something in my voice or my posture was slightly off from what he expected. He was used to the fear that precedes the moment of taking. I was not showing it. That makes you interesting, he said finally. His voice had changed slightly. Not afraid, he said, or just stupid. He seemed genuinely uncertain which one it was. I told him a simple truth. I told him that Paul had been skimming from Sethwick's accounts for 6 years. I told him the specific amounts and the specific methods. I did not tell him how I knew. I told him the specific amounts and specific methods, nothing extra, just the numbers. Gren's face changed when I finished. Changed considerably. He was a debt collector. He worked for Sethwick, which meant he knew the accounts, which meant he could verify what I was saying, and he knew immediately that I was not making it up. The numbers were too specific for invention. He was quiet for a moment. His 2 men looked at each other. Why are you telling me this? Gren said. Because Paul is going to tell Sethwick that my family owes more than we do. I said. He has been adjusting records. When you bring Sethwick this information, you tell him that Wei from Dunmao was the source. Then my debt goes away and we are even. Gren looked at me for a long time. He was recalculating, not who I was. He had no way to know that. But what kind of person sat in a ruined house at the edge of a village and had this specific kind of knowledge and this specific kind of calm? He nodded once, a slow deliberate nod. Then he left. His 2 men followed without taking anything from my house. I watched them go down the road until they were out of sight. I went back inside, sat down on the mat, let out a slow breath and held it for a moment before releasing it completely. That had worked. For now, that had been a calculated risk. Paul would eventually find out that someone had given Gren that information. Paul would suspect me, which meant Paul would become an enemy. But Paul was already a potential threat, the kind of man who, if he ever felt threatened by my growing presence in the village, could use his position to make trouble. Better to remove him as a variable now than to allow him time to develop into a larger and more complicated problem when I was less prepared to deal with it. Also, Sethwick would now know my name. Not well, not importantly, but he would know it existed. That was a seed. Small seeds planted early grow into large things given enough time. 3 days later I heard from Torv that Paul had been summoned to the manor. He came back 2 days after that looking like a man who had been very thoroughly warned about something. He avoided my side of the village entirely for the next week. Torv came to my door again on the morning of the 5th day after Gren's visit. He had something in his hands wrapped in cloth. His expression was different from the last time he had been to my door. Less careful, more like someone who had decided something. I owe you an apology, he said. I thought you were going to try to fight him or do something reckless. I was going to warn you not to. You handled it differently than I expected. He handed me something as he said this. A small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was dried meat, a portion of hard cheese, and a small amount of salt. That was worth considerably more than it sounds. Salt in Dunmao was currency in the most literal sense. People traded it instead of coin for smaller transactions. Torv had given me a meaningful amount. I thanked him and he nodded and left without adding another word. Torv operated on the principle that everything necessary had already been said. I respected that. That was the moment I understood that the first real relationship in this new life had been established. Not a friendship exactly. Something more functional and more durable than friendship. A working trust between the people who had assessed each other carefully and found the assessment satisfactory. That was what I had been building, not a reputation. Relationships, the specific kind that hold in difficult circumstances because they are built on observed behavior, rather than assumption. The next morning I went up the mountain again, further this time, past the marker, past where I had been climbing before, up to the second ridge that I had been scouting from a distance. The terrain above the second ridge was different, less path and more open rock, the kind of climbing that requires both hands. I had been waiting to go further until the body felt stable, until I understood what it could and could not do under real stress. I felt ready. I climbed for 2 hours and reached a flat area between the larger formations. The kind of spot that is sheltered from wind and invisible from below. The kind of spot that is used deliberately for things people do not want visible from the valley below. Someone had chosen this location on purpose. There was a fire ring old. The ash had been compressed by weather and the stones around it were stained with years of use. This had not been used recently, but it had been used regularly for a long time. There were also marks on the rock face behind the fire ring, the same 2 circle symbol from the lower marker, and others. Different symbols were carved alongside them. Some I recognized as directional markers for military usage. Some I did not recognize at all and could not place in any context I had. Someone had been using the spot as a meeting point or a staging area. The quantity of marks suggested it had been in use for years. The condition of the fire ring suggested the last use was at least 1 full season ago, possibly 2 seasons. Old enough to look abandoned, recent enough to matter. I sat down in the sheltered spot and spent a long time thinking carefully about what I was actually looking at and what it meant for the sequence of events. I was trying to understand. A family with powerful enemies in the high passes, a child hidden in a village, a network of markers on the mountain that had been in active use and then stopped suddenly. About a year or 2 ago, the timing of Wei's parents' death was not something I had ever pinned down precisely from his memories, but it was within that same window. The network had stopped at the same time the family was destroyed, which meant the network had belonged to the family. This was not a coincidence. It was a consequence, which meant Wei's parents had been part of something organized and intentional that used this mountain as infrastructure, which meant there might be others still alive, people connected to the same network who had survived whatever had killed Wei's parents and had been waiting since. People connected to the same network who were still alive, who did not know that the child they had been protecting with these markers and this secrecy was still alive and was here and was waiting. Or people who did know that the child was still alive and were waiting for the right signal, waiting for something specific, waiting for me to do exactly what I had done. I thought about the new mark on the lower stone, 1 line with a vertical through its right end, added after my visit by someone who had been checking the marker and found it recently disturbed. That check had happened within 8 days of my visit, which meant someone was monitoring this mountain regularly, within a day's distance, close enough to check a specific marker within 8 days of it being touched. I was not as alone on this mountain as I had assumed. That was either very good news or very bad news. I did not yet have enough information to know which, and that uncertainty was its own kind of pressure that I needed to sit with carefully. I stood up, looked at the fire ring, looked at the marks, then I did something calculated and deliberate. I added a mark of my own to the rock face, not one of the existing symbols, something new, to parallel vertical lines with a horizontal connecting them. Simple, unambiguous to anyone who was already paying attention to marks on this rock face. I am here. I found this place. I found the markers. I am waiting, and I am ready, and I am not what anyone in this valley believes me to be. Then I replaced the moss carefully over the marks I had made and climbed back down to the valley, walking at a normal pace, not hurrying, never hurrying. The wait after that was the hardest part. Harder than the physical tests and harder than the careful work of building relationships in Dunmao had been. Active restraint is harder than most things, because waiting when you know something is possible but do not know when it will resolve is its own specific kind of discipline. Not patience exactly. Active restraint. I kept the routine. Dawn climbs, village work, evenings at the well area watching S's complicated new song, and Cobb's sharp steady attention. Cobb spoke to me on the 52nd day. He had been moving incrementally closer for a week, the way children do when they are curious about something and trying to decide whether it is safe to approach. He stopped about 2 meters away and looked at me for a long, careful moment, like he was checking whether what he was about to say was still true. "You're different from before," he said. He said it the way a person states a fact they have been sitting with for a while and have finally decided to say out loud. I know. I said. I said it without elaborating. Sometimes the right answer is just confirmation and then silence. How? He asked. He looked up at me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. He genuinely wanted to understand the mechanism, not the fact, the how. I thought about how to answer that honestly without saying anything true. I said, I got tired of being what people expected me to be. Cobb thought about that for a moment with a focused expression he used for everything. Then he nodded once, as if that answer had confirmed something he had already suspected, and he walked away. He came back the next day and sat near me while I was doing small repairs on the fence. He did not say anything. He just sat nearby and watched the road the same way Penn did every morning. Like he was waiting for something he had not yet identified but was confident it would eventually arrive. That was fine. I was not in a hurry with Cobb. I was not in a hurry, and the boy was worth the patience it would take to reach the point where he trusted me enough to be fully useful. On the 57th day, Essa finally spoke to me. Not casually, not by accident. She stopped specifically and turned and spoke like someone delivering a message they had been holding. She had finished her evening water collection and was walking back toward the village center. And she stopped a few steps past me and said, without turning around, "You have been watching me for a long time." I said, "About 3 weeks." I had been keeping count. I counted most things. It was a habit from years of managing situations where small details accumulated into important patterns. She turned then. Her expression was not hostile, more like someone who had been waiting for a conversation to begin and was mildly irritated that it had taken this long to start. She said, "We never watched anyone." He looked at people by accident and then looked away. I know. I said. I said it without elaborating. Sometimes the right answer is just confirmation and then silence. She studied me. The way she did it was specific, not the way Tor studied me, which was a man assessing whether I was trustworthy. The way Essa studied me was the way someone studies a problem they have seen before in a different form. "You sound different," she said. "Your voice, the way you put words together." Wei did not do that. I did not say anything. I waited. Essa was a person who said things when she was ready to say them, and silence was the correct response when she was still deciding what that was. She said, "I am not going to ask what happened. I am going to tell you something instead. There is a woman who comes to this valley once a year. She comes in the early spring. She asks about certain things. She asked about Wei 2 years ago. She will ask again when she comes." I kept my expression neutral. "What things does she ask about?" I said. My voice was calm. The voice of someone who is simply gathering information and has no particular reason to be alarmed by what they might hear. Calm and open and waiting. "Children who are different," Essa said. "Children who do not fit. Children whose bodies do things that bodies are not supposed to do." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "How do you know this?" I asked. I asked it quietly, without urgency. The question that mattered was not how. The question that actually mattered was not how Essa knew. It was what she had already decided to do with that knowledge before she told me. "Because she asked me about you," Essa said. 2 years ago, I told her there was nothing unusual about Wei. She seemed to believe me. She left. But she will come back in the spring. Essa held my gaze for one more moment. Then she picked up her water jars and walked toward the village and did not look back. I stood at the well in the cold evening for a long time after Essa was gone. The water jars she had been carrying left small circular marks in the dirt where she had set them down. A woman who traveled to remote valleys asking about children who were different. Children whose bodies did things bodies were not supposed to do. Coming back every year. Asking specifically about Wei 2 years ago, which meant she had already identified him as a person of interest from some other source. That was not good news in any straightforward sense. It could mean protection. It could mean exactly the opposite. I did not have enough information to know which. What I knew was this. The network of markers on the mountain had gone silent about a year or two ago. The woman had been asking about Wei 2 years ago. Those timelines overlapped in a way that was not comfortable to think about. Two events that happened at the same time are usually one event described from two angles. If the network had been protecting Wei and had been destroyed, and if this woman was connected to the people who had destroyed it, then her visits were surveillance. She was checking to see if the child who had been hidden was still hidden. And if she ever stopped believing he was ordinary, she would stop visiting and start sending something else. I walked home slowly and sat down on the mat and held the wooden horse for a long time. The careful parallel cuts in the mane caught the last light from the cracked wall. I had been building slowly and carefully and with patience. I had been doing the right things in the right order. But slow, careful work requires time. and time was now a variable I did not fully control. Spring was maybe for months away. The woman would come. Essa had given me the warning, which meant Essa had already decided something about me, had decided I was worth warning. That was significant. I needed to understand what Essa actually knew and how she knew it and what she intended to do with that knowledge. I also needed to get to those mountain markers before spring and leave a message there for whoever was checking them. Because whoever that person was, they were either an ally or an enemy, and I needed to know which before the woman arrived. I picked up the wooden horse, turned it in my hands. The eyes of the horse watched something only they could see. I was running out of time to be patient. I needed to move faster now, carefully and deliberately, but faster than I had been moving. Spring would not wait for me to be ready. I did not sleep well that night. That was new. I had slept well through worse things than an uncertain situation. Battlefield sieges. 3 days without food on a mountain in winter. But something about S's warning stayed in my chest in a way that the physical dangers had not. Physical danger I knew how to process. This was different. This was time running out in a direction I could not fully see. I was up before dawn and on the mountain before the valley had fully decided to wake up. Not to the marker, not yet. I needed to think first. The lower slopes were quiet. Fresh snow from the night before. The kind of morning where the mountain feels like it is holding its breath and you are the only thing in the world making footprints. I climbed to a flat rock I had found in the second week. High enough for a view of the valley and the road coming in from the north. Low enough to get back down quickly if needed. I sat and watched the valley wake up below me. 300 people, one road. One man checking markers on this mountain within 8 days of my visit. One woman coming in spring who asked about children whose bodies did things bodies were not supposed to do. For months between me and that conversation. And me. A dead general in a boy's body with 2 lifetimes of memories and a wooden horse under a sleeping gnat, and for months before the situation forced itself into something I could not control. I needed allies. Not relationships. Not working trusts. Actual allies who knew something true about what I was and had already decided to be useful. Essa knew something. Torv knew something partial. The person on the mountain knew something. Those were the 3 threads. I needed to pull all of them before spring. I came down from the mountain and went directly to Essa's house. That was a departure from the careful patient approach I had been using. But careful patience has a season and I had just been told that season was ending. Essa answered the door the same way she did everything. Without surprise. Without performance. Like she had been expecting me to show up eventually and had simply been waiting for me to figure out the timing myself. I said, the woman who comes in spring. Tell me everything you know about her. I said it without preamble because there was no longer time for a careful approach. Essa looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let me in. That was the first time I had been inside anyone's home in Dunmao besides my own. Her house was small but organized in a way that Wei's never had been. Everything in a specific place for a specific reason. The kind of order that comes from someone who thinks carefully about how they use space and does not waste a single corner of the room on anything unnecessary. She put water on for tea. I did not tell her I did not need tea. You let people do what makes them comfortable when you need them to talk. The woman's name is Sira, Essa said. She travels alone. She comes in early spring when the high pass opens. She stays 2 or 3 days, asks her questions, and leaves the same way she came. I asked how long Essa had known about her. She answered without hesitating, which meant she had been ready to answer this question for a while. 5 years, Essa said. She came the first time when I was 14. She asked about a boy in the village to valleys east who had survived a fall that should have killed him. She asked about a girl in our valley whose wounds closed faster than they should. She asked about Wei. What did you tell her about Wei? I said that he was strange, but not in any way that mattered, Essa said. That he talked to himself and startled easily and had no friends. That he was the kind of strange that comes from a sad childhood and nothing else. That there was nothing unusual about him except his circumstances. Sierra believed it. She handed me the tea. Her hands were steady. This was not a woman who was afraid of this conversation. She had been waiting for it. Why did you protect him? I asked. You didn't know him. He didn't know you. Essa sat down across from me. She looked at her tea for a moment. My mother told me about children like Wei, she said, before she died. She told me that some children carry something that powerful people want to find and take. She told me that if I ever met a child like that, the right thing to do was to make them invisible. I held that for a moment. Her mother had known, which meant her mother had been connected to something larger. Which meant Essa might be more than a girl who had done a kind thing. She might be part of the same network that the mountain markers belonged to. Your mother, I said. What did she do before she died? Essa looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that neutral expressions only are when someone is deciding how much to say. She traveled, Essa said. She knew people in different places. She came back to Dunmao when I was 7 and never left again. She died 3 years later. Same window as the markers, I thought. Same window as the network going quiet. Same window as Wei being brought down from the mountain and left in a broken building at the edge of the village. Your mother was part of it, I said. Not a question. Essa nodded once. Exactly the way Torv nodded. This village grew people who communicated in very precise minimal gestures. I respected that. She helped move the boy, Essa said. She was the one who made sure he ended up in Dunmao specifically. She chose this village. She chose it because it was far enough from the main road that nobody important would ever pass through, and because she knew the elder and trusted his character. Torv, I said. Torv, she said. I had known Torv was part of something. I had not known he had been part of this specifically. I recalculated several things at once. Does Torv know what I am? I asked. What I actually am. Not just that I am different from the boy who was here before. What I actually am. He knows you are different from the boy who was here before, Essa said. He does not know why. He knows that whoever Wei actually was, his parents were people worth protecting. That was enough for Torv. I asked about Sira again, the woman who came in spring, who traveled remote valleys, who asked specific questions. What did she actually want with children like Wei? Essa set down her tea and looked at me directly. She said, my mother believed that Sira was looking for children to train, that she ran something, a school, a compound, some kind of place where children with unusual abilities were taken and shaped into useful things. My mother did not think that was entirely bad. She thought it was better than the alternative, Essa said. I asked, what is the alternative? Essa's expression changed slightly when I asked, like the answer was something she had been hoping not to say. Essa said, there are other people who look for children like Wei. They are not interested in training. They are interested in something else entirely. My mother would not tell me what. She just told me that Sira was the safer of the two and that if Sira ever found Wei, the correct response was probably to let her have him. I thought about that. A woman who traveled remote valleys looking for unusual children and brought them somewhere. A network of markers on a mountain that had been destroyed. A family with powerful enemies that the network had apparently been protecting Wei from for the entirety of his short forgotten life in this valley. The question was whether Sira was connected to the family's enemies or to the family's allies. Both options produced a woman who came looking for Wei every year. The difference was in what she intended to do when she found him. I need to meet her before she arrives in the village, I said. Essa looked at me with something that was close to surprise. Not quite. More like the look of someone who had expected a different response and was adjusting. You want to intercept her on the road before she reaches the village, Essa said. She said it as a statement. She was already understanding the logic of it. I want to talk to her before she has the context of the village around her, I said. I want to be a stranger to her, not a village boy. I want to have the conversation on ground I choose, not ground she chooses. Essa was quiet for a moment. Then, she comes through the high pass. There is a way station at the south end of the pass, a day's walk above the valley. That is where she usually rests before coming down. I nodded. That was where I would be when she arrived. Before I left Essa's house, I asked one more thing. The boy Cobb, the sharp-eyed one. What did Essa know about him? Essa said, his grandmother was my mother's closest friend. They traveled together for 2 years before Cobb's grandmother came back to Dunmao to raise him. She died last winter. Cobb does not know what his grandmother was or what she did, but he has her eyes and her stillness. He sees things. He always has. I thanked Essa and left. I walked back through the village slowly enough to look like I was not thinking about anything in particular. I was thinking about several things simultaneously. Cobb was not an accident. The 3 people I had identified as worth knowing in Dunmao had all turned out to be connected to the same network. The old watcher on the road, the careful girl at the well, the sharp-eyed boy with his grandmother's eyes. Dunmao was not just a random village. It had been chosen and seeded, which meant the coming back to life here, in Wei's body, was either an extraordinary coincidence or it was not a coincidence at all. I was not yet ready to think fully about that second possibility. I put it in the file and left it there for later. That afternoon, I went to Torv without waiting and without easing into the conversation. I told him directly, the way he had always preferred to receive information. I told him what Essa had told me and what I understood from it. I told him simply and directly because Torv was a man who responded to directness and found anything else a waste of time. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. "You know more than you should," he said finally. "Essa trusted me with it," I said. "I am trusting you with the fact that she did. That is how this works. You pass the trust forward and see where it lands." He looked at me with the expression he used when he was revising his assessment of something. That expression was becoming familiar. "What do you need?" he said. No questions before that. No demands for explanation. Just a practical question, asked by a man who had already decided to help. "I need to know what supplies exist in this village, what can be traded, what the fastest route to the way station above the pass actually is, not the route that looks fastest on the ground. And I need to know if anyone in Dunmao has made the climb to the way station in the last full year, whether the route above the second ridge has been used recently." Torv answered all three questions without asking why I needed the information. That was the difference between a working trust and a regular conversation. He had decided I was worth answering. He answered, "The fastest route to the way station was not the main path that everyone used. There was a secondary route through a section of loose rock that cut half a day off the climb. There was a secondary route that cut through a section of loose rock that nobody used because it looked dangerous and was, in fact, only moderately dangerous if you knew what you were doing. It cut half a day off the climb. Nobody had been to the way station in over a year. The last person was a merchant who had come down the pass and stayed one night before continuing to the capital. And the supply situation. There was considerably more stored in Dunmao than I had assumed from looking at how people lived on the surface of their daily routines. The village had been quietly stockpiling through the autumn, not collectively, but individually. Each family putting away what they could in anticipation of a harder winter than usual. Torv knew because he tracked these things as a matter of habit. There was enough that someone leaving for a few days would not be noticed as unusual. I went home and began preparing. Not dramatically, quietly. The way you prepare when the preparation itself needs to be invisible. The wooden horse went inside a small cloth pouch that I tied to the inside of my jacket. I was not leaving it behind. I had never been able to fully explain the instinct, but I had learned over 7 years to trust instincts that persisted without being able to justify themselves. I was at Cobb's usual spot the next morning before he arrived. He came around the corner of the elder's house and stopped when he saw me sitting there where Penn usually sat. He looked at me for a moment. I said, "Your grandmother, did she leave you anything when she died? Anything specific? Anything she told you to keep and not open or not share with anyone?" Cobb's expression did not change. He was 11 or 12, and he had the kind of stillness that only comes from either very calm circumstances or very difficult ones. His had come from the difficult kind. He said, "A box. I cannot open it." "What kind of lock?" I said. "Not a lock." He said, "It just will not open. I have tried everything." She said it would open when the right person touched it. I said, "Bring it here. I would like to hold it and see what happens when I do." He looked at me for a moment to decide if that was a reasonable request. He looked at me for a long moment with those sharp eyes. Then he nodded once and walked away. He came back 10 minutes later with a small wooden box about the size of a large book to hold. The wood was dark and smooth from handling. There was no visible lock or hinge mechanism from the outside. I took it in both hands. For a moment nothing happened. Then something did. Not dramatic, not a flash of light or a sound. Just a sensation like pressure releasing. Like a door that had been stuck suddenly swinging free on its own. The lid lifted when I touched it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a small cloth bundle tied with cord, and a flat stone disc with a 2-circle symbol carved into it. The same symbol from the mountain markers. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was small and precise. It was a letter, not addressed to Cobb, addressed to whoever opens this. I will not reproduce the whole letter here because some of what it contained was not mine to share yet. But the relevant parts were these. The woman who wrote it knew about Wei. She had helped place him in Dunmao. She had also placed markers on the mountain for the network's use. She had written this letter 2 years before she died, as things were getting worse, as the enemies who had destroyed Wei's family were getting closer to finding the trail. The letter said that the stone disc was a key, not a literal key, a way of identifying oneself to certain people. If the person holding the disc showed it to Sierra at the Wei station, Sierra would know they were part of the network and would treat them accordingly. It also said one other thing. It said that Wei's father had been something called a Reborn, that the ability to heal and the unusual physical capability were not random. They were specific. They had a name, and the stone disc was the first step toward understanding what the name meant. I sat with that for a long time. Cobb sat next to me without speaking. Waiting, Reborn. I turned the word over. Wei's memories had no context for it, but the word itself suggested something. Root, foundational, connected to something below the surface, something old. I looked at Cobb. He was watching me with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to finally make sense. Did your grandmother ever say the word Reborn to you? I asked. I said it carefully and watched his face. He thought about it with a focused expression he used for everything. He thought for a moment. Then, she said there were people in the world who carried the old lines. That most of them did not know what they were. That the ones who did were either very protected or very haunted. Both at once, I said, was also possible. Cobb looked at me for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, I know you are not Wei. I held it for a long moment. Her mother had known, which meant Essa was not just a girl who had done a kind thing. She might be part of the same network as the mountain markers. He said, Wei never sat like that. He never looked at anything the way you look at things. He was here, and then one day he was different. I have been trying to figure out what happened since the third day. I still do not know, but I know you are not him. I looked at this 11-year-old boy with his grandmother's eyes and his careful stillness and his 3-week-long patient investigation of me. You are correct, I said. I am not him. I am something that happened to this body after Wei was finished with it. I do not have a better explanation than that. He thought about it. Then he nodded. Once. Precisely. The same nod as Torv and Essa. This village grew people who spoke in the same language of single nods. That was community in the most fundamental sense. What do you need? Cobb said. He asked it the same way Torv asked it. Direct and practical. Already decided. Just waiting for the specific answer. That was the question everyone in this strange seated village seemed to eventually ask. What do you need? Not who are you? Not prove yourself. Not why should I trust you? Just, what do you need? I told him I needed a guide to the secondary route up to the way station. Someone who knew the loose rock section well enough to cross it safely. Someone small and sure-footed and comfortable with heights. He looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then he said, when do we leave? As if it were already settled. I said, 3 days. He nodded. Then he picked up a wooden box and walked home with it. He left the stone disc on the ground beside me. A deliberate leaving. A transfer of something. I held the disc. The two interlocked circles with a line through both. The same mark from the mountain. The same mark from the box. The key to a conversation with a woman who might be an ally or might be something that required a completely different kind of preparation. I needed to know which before I arrived. The next 3 days I spent on two things simultaneously. Physical preparation for the climb to the way station, which would be harder than anything I had done on the mountain so far. And information gathering, specifically about what I was going to say to Sierra when I found her and what I was prepared to give in exchange for what I needed from her. Because showing up at a way station in the high pass in winter with a boy and a stone disc and no plan was the kind of thing that got people killed even when the person they were approaching was not hostile. You do not approach an unknown contact without knowing what you want out of the meeting and what you are willing to give to get it. What I wanted was information about Reborn, about Wei's family, about what the network had been protecting him from and whether the threat was still active. What I was willing to give was myself, the truth of what I was, which was strange enough that it would either establish credibility immediately or destroy any chance of the conversation going well. There was no middle option when your truth was as unusual as mine had become. You either tell it fully or you say nothing and accomplish nothing with a meeting. On the second day, Torv came to my door again. He brought something with him that he set on the floor without explanation. A pack, already loaded. The kind of careful packing that a man does when he has been thinking about what someone else will need in the mountains. Roka-dried food, a small iron hand warmer with fuel, an extra layer of clothing that was considerably better quality than anything Wei had owned, and at the bottom of the pack, wrapped in cloth, a short knife. I looked at the knife. Torv looked at me. Iron is restricted, I said. He said, so is a lot of things that keep people alive. You are going up the mountain in winter. Take the knife. I took the knife. I also said, how did you know I was going? He said, Essa told me, and I watched you for the last 3 days. You have the look of a man preparing for something. I asked, what look is that? He said, calm. To calm. The kind of calm that comes from having made a decision and stopped arguing with yourself about it. He left after that. I sat with the pack and thought about Dunmao. 300 people at the edge of the world. A village that had been chosen and seated with specific people for a specific purpose. An elder who had been trusted by a woman who moved children to safety. A girl who had protected a boy she barely knew because her dying mother told her to. A boy with his grandmother's eyes who had been waiting his whole short life for someone to show up and make sense of what she had left him. These people had been taking care of Wei for years without knowing who he was or what he was, or whether any of it would ever matter. They had just done it because it was the right thing and because they had been told by people. They trusted that it was important. That was the most human thing I had encountered in either of my lifetimes. Doing something you could not fully justify because someone you trusted believed it mattered. I owed them more than information. I owed them the thing they had been building without knowing it, which was safety. The specific kind that comes from someone finally knowing enough to act. I was not there yet, and I knew it, but I was getting closer in the specific way that matters, which is having more of the right information and fewer dangerous gaps. On the third morning, I was at the edge of the village before the light was fully established. Cub was already there, pack on his back, expression of complete composure. 11 years old and standing there with a pack on his back ready to climb a mountain in winter. Like it was a routine errand he had been asked to run. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, if at any point this becomes more dangerous than I expected, you turn around. No arguments. You come back to the village and you tell Torv everything. He said, and if you do not come back, I said, then Torv will know what happened and what to do with the information. Cobb nodded. Once. Precisely. Then he turned and started walking toward the mountain without looking back to see if I was following. I was following. The secondary route was everything Torv had described. Difficult and fast in equal measure. The loose rock section required both hands and careful placement of every step. Cobb moved through it with the ease of someone who had been here before. More than once, I suspected. His grandmother's friend had brought him here. He had been practicing. We did not talk much on the climb. The mountain was not a place for conversation. It was a place for attention. Every step required its own full focus, and conversation pulled focus sideways. 3 hours up, past the second ridge, above the tree line where the air was thin and cold enough to bite through the extra layer Torv had packed. The way station was visible from the last major rise before the pass entrance. A low stone structure built into the rock face solid old. The kind of building that had been there long enough to become part of the mountain. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was inside. We were 6 days ahead of the earliest date Essa had estimated for Sierra's arrival. But someone was in the way station. Someone who had come through the pass before the usual season. Someone who was not a merchant or a traveler because merchants and travelers use the main path and the main way station at the north end of the pass. Not this one. I stopped Cobb with a hand on his shoulder. We crouched behind a rock formation and watched the building for 15 minutes. No movement outside. No sound except the wind and the fire inside. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out, middle-aged, traveling clothes that were practical and worn in. She looked at the sky the way people look at it when they are checking weather, not admiring it. She had a short staff strapped to her back and the particular stance of someone who moved through difficult terrain regularly and had stopped thinking of it as difficult. She looked directly at the rock formation we were hiding behind. She said, "You can come out. I have been watching you climb for the last hour." I stood up. Cobb stood up beside me. The woman looked at us both for a moment. Then her eyes went to my hand, where I was holding the stone disc with the 2 circle mark. Her expression changed. It did not become warm exactly. It became serious in a different way than it had been serious before. More focused. The way a person looks at something they have been waiting a long time to see and are not sure yet whether to trust that it is actually happening. She said, "Where did you get that?" I said, "From a boy whose grandmother left it for whoever could open the box." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mira's grandson. He is here. He is here," I said. I gestured to Cobb. The woman looked at Cobb for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "And you," she said. "Who are you?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I thought about what the letter had said. About Reborn. About the stone disc being the key. About S's mother trusting this woman as the safer option. "I am what happened to Wei after Wei was gone," I said. "I know that requires explanation. I am prepared to give it if you are prepared to listen." The woman studied me. The serious, focused expression did not change. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come inside," she said. She held the door open and looked at us both one more time. "We have a great deal to discuss," she said, and she did not sound surprised at all. The inside of the way station was small and warm and smelled like pine smoke and something else I could not immediately identify. Something faintly metallic, like the air before a storm. Sierra moved to the fire without looking at us. She added a piece of wood. She took her time with it. Not stalling dot thinking. The kind of deliberate movement that means a person is running calculations behind a calm face. She was deciding something important and she was not in a hurry about it. Cobb sat down on a low bench near the door without being invited. He pulled his pack off and set it at his feet and looked at the walls. He was cataloging the room the same way I had cataloged every room I entered since arriving in this body. I noticed that about him and filed it. I remained standing. I held the stone disc in my left hand where Sierra could see it. Not displaying it, just not hiding it. She sat down across the fire from me. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "How old is the body?" 14. I said, "Maybe 15. She nodded once. Then, "How long have you been in it?" 2 months. I said. She absorbed it without any visible reaction and moved directly to the next question. She did not react to any of this as if it were unusual. She had seen something like it before. That was the only explanation for the level of composure. "You know what happened to me," I said. "You are not surprised enough for this to be new to you. You have seen something like it before, and you already have a framework for it." She said, "Not exactly this, but close enough. There are old accounts. People who arrived in the wrong body at the wrong time. The texts call it wandering. There are maybe a dozen documented cases across several hundred years of records." I asked, "What happened to the people in those documented cases?" "Most of them," she said, "did not survive long enough to become documented. They were found by the wrong people before they understood what they were. The few who survived long enough to write anything down were the ones who stayed hidden and stayed quiet." I thought about the marker on the mountain, about the fire ring on the second ridge, about Wei's mother and S's mother and Cobb's grandmother, and a network of people who had spent years keeping a child safe without knowing exactly why he was worth keeping safe. Just knowing that he was. I said, "Wei was root-born. His father was." I found the letter. Sierra's expression shifted then. Not dramatically, a small change around the eyes. The kind that happens when someone has been expecting a specific word and hears it and their whole internal framework reorganizes around it. She said, "You read Mira's letter." I said, "Yes. I need you to tell me what root-born means. What it actually means, not the word itself." Sierra looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "Root-born is what happens when a bloodline carries a specific kind of connection to what the old traditions call the deep current. The foundational energy that runs below ordinary cultivation and ordinary magic. Most people who carry it do not know they carry it. The ability looks like physical resilience, enhanced healing, unusual strength. Nothing that announces itself clearly." I said, "It feels exactly like that from the inside. Nothing announces itself. It just performs." She looked at me. There was something in her expression that was close to recognition. Like she was looking at someone she had been trying to find for a long time and was still not certain she had found them. She said, "The deep current is old. Older than any kingdom. Older than most of what people think of as history. The people who understand it, who can actually work with it deliberately rather than just carrying it passively, are very few. And they are very wanted by certain parties." I asked, "What parties?" She said, "The people who destroyed Wei's family, who have been eliminating root-born lines for 3 generations, not because they fear the capability itself, because of what a root-born who is properly trained can access. Not just physical resilience, something else, something that the people doing the eliminating specifically do not want accessed." The question I had been carrying since I found the letter was right there. I asked it, "What can a root-born access that is worth destroying an entire bloodline to prevent?" Sierra looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Memory. Not personal memory, old memory. The deep current carries echoes of everything that has ever moved through it. A properly trained root-born can learn to read those echoes, to find things that have been deliberately hidden in them by people who understood the current well enough to use it that way. Things that certain people have spent considerable effort and considerable organized violence across 3 generations ensuring would stay hidden from everyone." I held that. To lifetimes of memory already sitting in one body, and now the suggestion that this body could access a third kind of memory. A deep and old one that certain people were killing bloodlines to keep buried. I said, "Wei's family was destroyed because they were getting close to reading something specific." Sierra said, "That is what I believe. Yes." Cobb had been absolutely still on his bench since Sierra started speaking. He was listening with the attention of a boy who has spent his whole life knowing that the adults around him were keeping important things back. He had been waiting patiently for someone to finally stop keeping them back. That patience had its own particular quality. I recognized it because I had practiced a version of it myself. I looked at him. He looked back at me. He said nothing. He was waiting for me to continue. I turned back to Sierra. I said, the people who destroyed Wei's family, are they still looking? She said, yes. They have been looking for the child specifically for 2 years. They know a child was hidden. They have not been able to locate where. My visits have been partly cover. I come through these valleys in spring asking questions about unusual children, and what I find mostly gets reported back through channels that give false information to the searchers. I have been feeding them wrong locations and wrong descriptions for years. You have been protecting the cover, I said. She said, I have been trying to. It is getting harder. The people searching are becoming more sophisticated. 2 years ago, they started sending their own people rather than working through intermediaries. Last year, one of them came through this pass specifically. She said, they were looking for confirmation. I said, what happened when they came through? She said, I handled it, but it was close, and there will be more. There are always more when the people at the top of this particular hierarchy decide something is important enough. I asked the next question carefully. I asked, do they know Wei is dead? Sarah looked at me for a moment that was slightly longer than it needed to be. She said, they know the boy they were looking for is no longer the same boy. They do not know why. They are confused by it. One of their contacts in the region reported that the boy in Dunmao had changed significantly, that he no longer matched the profile they were tracking. They pulled back from this area for now. They are reassessing, which means they will return. I said, which means they will return. She agreed. I looked at the fire for a moment. Then I said, I am not Wei. I am someone else in Wei's body. But I have 2 months of living in this body, and this body's history is part of me now. And what was done to the family that produced this body is something I have a personal interest in addressing. I also have a previous life's worth of reasons for wanting to dismantle a specific network of powerful people who destroyed someone who was not convenient to them. Sarah looked at me. She said, who were you before? I said, a general in a kingdom called Renville. I was executed on false charges arranged by someone I trusted. The king signed the order. I woke up here. She was quiet for a moment in the specific way of someone choosing which version of the truth to give. Then she gave me the full one, which I appreciated. Then she said it back as a summary to make sure she had it right. You were a general, and you woke up in a 14-year-old root-born body in a hidden village, with a network of markers on the mountain and the enemies of the root-born bloodline, actively searching the region. She said it back to me as a summary to confirm she had understood correctly. I said, yes. She said, either you have the worst luck in 2 worlds or the best. I said, I have been trying to determine which. Something shifted in Sierra's expression then. The serious focus look did not go away, but something underneath it changed. She had been assessing me since the moment I stood up from behind the rock. She had been running a very specific calculation this entire conversation. I had just given her the final variable, and she was reorganizing around it. She said, I can train you. What the letter described, what the stone disc represents, it is access to a network that has been maintaining the old knowledge of the deep current for generations. There are people who know how to work with what a rootborn carries, not many, but they exist, and I know where they are. I said, in exchange for what? Because nothing that has real value comes without a real cost, and I was not going to pretend otherwise or let her pretend otherwise. She said, in exchange for the memory. When you are trained enough to access what the deep current carries, whatever Wei's family was approaching before they were destroyed, I need you to find it. That is what I have been working toward for 9 years. That is the actual reason I come through these valleys. I thought about that. A woman who had been running cover operations for years and feeding false information to dangerous people, who had handled at least one direct threat through this past last year, who was offering real training in exchange for something she had been working toward for nearly a decade. That was the kind of exchange you take seriously and examine carefully. She was not wrong to ask. She had been carrying this for a long time, and she was asking for something specific and real in return for something specific and real. That was the kind of exchange I understood. I said, agreed, with conditions. I said it directly because that was the kind of conversation we were having. She said, name them. She said it the same way. I said, Dunmao stays protected. The village, the people in it. Whatever you know about the people searching, whatever cover you maintain, Dunmao stays out of the path of it. If I am going to learn to use this, I am not doing it at the cost of the people who kept this body alive for 14 years without knowing what they were protecting. Sarah nodded. She said, that was always my intention. Dunmao stays out of it. She said it like a principle she had been carrying for years, not a concession. I said, and Cobb comes with me. He has his grandmother's eyes. He has been watching things his whole life with no context for what he is seeing. He deserves the context. Cobb looked up from his bench. He had been very still. He said nothing, but something in his face changed that I had not seen in it before. Something that looked like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just been told they do not have to anymore. Sarah looked at Cobb for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are seeing the person they came from. Then she said, yes, his grandmother would have wanted exactly that. The three of us sat with the fire for a while after that. Not talking, not planning, just sitting with the weight of what had been decided. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after real agreement. Not comfortable silence, something heavier. The silence of people who have just committed to something difficult and are absorbing what that means. I thought about David in his warm room in Orenville, about the king who had signed the warrant, about the crown prince who had wept real tears at a trial whose evidence was fabricated, about a metal that was cold and heavy and penned by hands that were already planning everything. That came after the ceremony and the crime happening 6 months apart. I thought about Dunmao, poor with his single knot and his pack of supplies. Essa, who had protected a boy she barely knew because her dying mother told her it was the right thing. The 300 people who had been carefully going about their lives in a village that had been placed there on purpose. I thought about the wooden horse under the mat, about the parallel cuts in the mane that caught light differently at each angle, about a parent who had made something carefully for a child they were leaving somewhere. They could not protect them. All of these things were connected now. They had always been connected. I had just been accumulating the pieces in the right order to see the shape. Before we left the way station, I asked Sarah one more thing. I asked the people who destroyed Way's family, do they have a name, an organization, something I can track? She said, they call themselves the Unwritten. They have been operating for 3 generations. They are not small. They have people in governments, in trade networks, and the kind of institutions that touch everything without anyone noticing. They are the reason the old knowledge of the deep current has been disappearing. They are methodical and patient and very good at what they do. 3 generations of practice. They have eliminated most of the people who might have challenged them, which means the people left are the ones who were small enough or hidden enough to survive. Not many of either. I said, so am I. Sarah looked at me. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, I know. That is actually why I am not more worried. I did not ask what she meant by that. I filed it where I filed everything that I did not yet fully understand. Everything in its correct place until the time came to use it. We left the way station as the afternoon light was going flat and cold. Cobb carried his pack with the same composure he had carried everything. Sarah walked ahead, checking the path, already back in the practical mode of someone who moves through difficult terrain for a living. I paused at the door of the way station and looked back at the fire. Still burning, the metallic smell still in the air. The smell of the deep current, I realized now. That was what it was. Not storm ozone, not pine smoke, something older. Something that had been in the air around me since I arrived in this body and I had not had a name for until now. I had been breathing it for 2 months without knowing what I was breathing. I stepped outside. The mountain was cold and clear and enormous in every direction. The valley was small below us, the village invisible from this height. 300 people going about their lives in the particular way of people who have learned to survive by staying unremarkable. I was going to make sure they stayed safe. That was not a decision I made on the mountain. It was a decision I had made the moment I saw S's expression when she warned me about Sarah. The moment I understood that these people had been protecting something they barely understood for years because someone they trusted had asked them to. You do not leave people like that unprotected. Not when you have the capability to protect them and a reason to use it. We climbed down in the late afternoon. Cobb took the loose rock section without hesitating. Sarah moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had made significantly harder climbs in worse conditions. I was in the middle, and I felt the body performing the way it had performed since the beginning, quietly and completely and without fanfare. Reborn. I had a name for it now. The old lines, the deep current, the things certain people were willing to destroy bloodlines to prevent someone from accessing. I was going to access it, not because Sarah asked me to, because whatever way his family had been approaching was important enough that someone spent years destroying them to stop it from being found. And important things that someone is trying to hide are exactly the kind of things that need to be found. But first things first, we reached the valley floor as the last light was going. The village was ahead, warm windows in the dark, a place that had been chosen and seated and maintained without full knowledge of its own purpose. Torv was sitting outside his house when we came through the village entrance. He looked at the three of us, at me, at Cobb, at Sierra, who he had clearly seen before and whose presence here told him something he was absorbing carefully. He said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once. The specific nod. The one that meant, I see. I understand. We continue. I nodded back. Inside my house, I sat on the mat and pulled the wooden horse from the pouch inside my jacket. I held it for a moment in the firelight. The carved eyes watched their invisible something with that particular attention. I thought, whoever made this knew what they were making it for. Not just a toy for a hidden child. A marker. A reminder. A promise that someone had seen this child clearly and had considered the seeing worth the effort of making something true and lasting. That was all it said. That was enough. I had been seen. In the palace in Erenville, in the valley of Dunmao, in the way station on the mountain, seen by different people for different reasons in both of my lives. The question was what I was going to do with it. I knew the answer. I had known it since the platform in Erenville with the crowd screaming and Davin's cold relief in the crowd and the blade coming down. I had just been building the foundation under the answer for 2 months, carefully and methodically and in the correct order. That was the only way foundations held. The unwritten had been operating for 3 generations. They had been eliminating bloodlines and hiding old knowledge and feeding wrong information to anyone who might get close to what they were protecting. They had not planned for a dead general from a different world who woke up in a reborn body with 2 lifetimes of memory and for months to prepare before someone came looking. They had not planned for Dunmao, for Tor's nods and S's careful protection and Cobb's grandmother's lockbox and a stone disc that opened conversations. They had not planned for any of it. That was the thing about plans that are built to be invisible. When something appears that was never a part of the calculation, the whole structure has to adjust. And structures that have been invisible for 3 generations are not built to adjust. They are built to eliminate. They would try to eliminate. They always did. They were very good at it. I was going to be better. I put the wooden horse back under the mat. I lay down on the sleeping mat in the cracked house at the edge of the village, in the body of a dead boy, and I looked at the ceiling and thought about everything that was coming. It was going to be hard. Genuinely hard. Not the kind of hard that sounds hard from a distance and turns out to be manageable up close. The real kind. The kind that costs things you do not get back. I knew that. I had been a general. I had lost people. I had made decisions in the dark with incomplete information and lived with the results of those decisions for years. I understood the real weight of hard things and what they cost. I had lived with that cost before and would live with it again. I was still going to do it. The fire crackled in the small stove in the corner of the room. Outside, the mountain was cold and dark and full of things I did not yet understand. Inside, 300 people were sleeping in a village that had been placed there for a reason that was finally, after 14 years, about to matter. The village idiot had the lifetimes of memory and a root-born body and a stone disc and a boy with his grandmother's eyes. A woman who had been running cover operations for years, and a very specific list of people into worlds who needed to be held accountable for what they had done. In Erenville and here, in both worlds, it was enough to start with. It was, in fact, considerably more than I had started with the last time. I closed my eyes. I thought about the deep current running below everything, old and patient and full of things that had been buried in it, things someone did not want found. I was going to find them. I fell asleep with a wooden horse under the mat and the mountain outside the cracked wall, and everything finally, after 2 months, moving in the right direction. That is part 4. If you want to see what happens when Kale finally faces the unwritten, and what is buried in the deep current that they have been killing to protect, drop a comment below. If this story hit different, subscribe. There is a lot more coming.